The dusty winds of 1888 swept across the high timberline of Montana, carrying the scent of raw pine and unspoken grief. If you seek stories where the heart finds its anchor amidst the wild, you have found your sanctuary. Welcome to Dust and Devotion Tales. Subscribe and let the journey begin. Clara Woods stepped off the iron car and onto a platform that felt like the edge of the world. The locomotive exhaled a final, hissing breath of white steam, leaving her standing in a silence so vast it made her ears ring. Around her, the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Range tore at the gray underbelly of the clouds, casting long, bruised shadows over the valley. She adjusted the grip on her grandfather's tool chest, the weight of the iron chisels pulling at her shoulder as a reminder of the only legacy she had left. Her coat was a thin shield against the biting mountain air, its fabric worn smooth at the elbows from years of leaning over sewing tables in the humid crowdedness of the east. Here, the air was different. It was sharp and tasted of snow that had not yet fallen. She looked down at the crumpled paper in her hand, the ink blurring where her thumb had pressed too hard. It promised a position for a woodworker's assistant and a keeper of the hearth at a remote mill. To anyone else, it was a sentence of isolation, but to Clara, it was a fortress. She needed the distance. She needed the miles of pine and granite to act as a barrier between her and the charred remains of a life that had ended in a Philadelphia tenement fire. As the stagecoach rumbled toward her, its wheels caked in frozen mud, she felt the first stirrings of a terrifying liberty. There were no neighbors here to whisper about her loss, no pitying glances from shopkeepers who knew her father's debts. There was only the looming forest and the promise of work that would blister her hands until her mind finally went quiet. She climbed into the carriage, the leather seat smelling of old rain and tobacco, and watched the small station vanish into the mist. Every turn of the wheel took her deeper into a wilderness that demanded everything and promised nothing but survival. Her boots, thin-soled and unsuitable for the rugged terrain, felt like a metaphor for her own readiness, yet she did not look back. The road began its steep ascent, winding through corridors of ancient larch and fir that seemed to close ranks behind her, sealing the way home. She was 24 years old. Her possessions amounted to a box of steel and a change of linen, and she was heading toward a man she had never met in a land that broke even the strongest of souls. The Thorn Mill appeared as a jagged silhouette against the darkening timber, a structure of massive hewn logs that looked as though it had grown directly out of the mountainside. Gabriel Thorn stood in the yard, his frame nearly as imposing as the trees he harvested. When Clara stepped down, he offered no greeting, only a long and piercing look that seemed to measure the depth of her exhaustion. His face was a map of hard seasons, with a beard the color of iron and eyes that held the cold stillness of a mountain lake. He turned without a word, gesturing for her to follow him into the house. It was a cavern of shadows, smelling of wood smoke, and a profound, heavy loneliness that seemed to cling to the rafters. He had expected a man, someone with shoulders broad enough to haul timber and skin thick enough to endure the high-altitude frost. Seeing the slight woman with the silver-handled toolbox, he felt a familiar surge of resentment toward a world that kept sending him reminders of fragility. He turned without a word, gesturing for her to follow him into the house. The interior was a cavern of shadows, smelling of wood smoke, stale coffee, and a profound, heavy loneliness that seemed to cling to the rafters. There were no curtains at the windows, and the hearth was a heap of cold ash. Gabriel pointed toward a small room off the kitchen, a space barely large enough for a cot and a washstand, before disappearing back into the twilight of the yard. Clara stood in the center of the kitchen, the silence of the house pressing against her chest like a physical weight. It was a place where life had been lived once, evidenced by a woman's discarded thimble on a windowsill and a set of mismatched plates, but that life had been eclipsed by a long, dark winter of the soul. She realized then that she had not just been hired to mend furniture or cook meals, she had been brought into a tomb that was still inhabited by a man who refused to die. She set her toolbox on the floor, the metallic clink echoing through the hollow rooms, and began the task of building a fire. Her fingers were numb, and the wood was damp, but she worked with a feverish intensity, needing the light to push back the ghosts that seemed to flicker in the corners of Gabriel Thorne's eyes. By the second week, the rhythmic scream of the saw blade became the heartbeat of Clara's existence. She rose long before the sun touched the peaks, moving through the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of a woman who knew that order was the only defense against despair. In the absence of Gabriel, Clara waged a war against the decay of the household. She scrubbed the floorboards until the natural grain of the pine emerged like a hidden map. Gabriel remained a ghost in his own home, eating the meals she prepared in a silence so thick it felt like a third person at the table. Yet the mountain air was turning sharper, and a bewildered, aching curiosity began to grow between them. In the absence of Gabriel, Clara waged a war against the decay of the household. She scrubbed the floorboards until the natural grain of the pine emerged like a hidden map, and she polished the windows until the forest outside seemed to press directly against the glass. She found a strange peace in the labor, her mind focusing on the sensory details of her chores to avoid the aching memory of the fire. When she wasn't cleaning, she opened her chest and began to repair the broken slats of the kitchen chairs, her chisels biting into the wood with a precision that would have surprised Gabriel had he deigned to watch. He remained a ghost in his own home, eating the meals she prepared in a silence so thick it felt like a third person at the table. He never thanked her, nor did he complain when the salt ran low or the bread was hard. He moved with a mechanical heaviness, his spirit seemingly trapped in the act of mere endurance. Yet Clara began to notice the small changes. He no longer left his muddy coat on the floor, and once she found a pile of fresh kindling neatly stacked by the stove that she hadn't gathered herself. On Sundays, the mill went silent, and the absence of the saw's roar felt louder than the noise itself. They would sit on opposite ends of the porch, watching the hawks circle the valley, two strangers bound by a contract of necessity and a shared inability to speak of the things that had broken them. The mountain air was turning sharper, the larch needles falling in golden drifts that covered the paths, and the first true frost began to lace the edges of the wash basin every morning. Clara felt the season changing not just in the weather, but in the way Gabriel looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, a gaze that was no longer filled with irritation, but with a bewildered, aching curiosity. The clouds descended low and heavy, turning the sky into a sheet of lead just as the first true blizzard of the year roared over the Continental Divide. Clara was in the depths of the root cellar, checking the winter stores, when the wind shifted to a predatory howl that shook the very foundations of the mill. She hurried back up to the main house, her breath blooming in white plumes, only to find the kitchen door standing open and a swirl of snow invading the room. Gabriel was not in the house. Panic, sharp and cold as an icicle, pierced her chest as she realized he had gone to the high barn to check on the draft horses. She fought the door shut, leaning her weight against the oak planking, and waited. Minutes stretched into an hour, the world outside vanishing into a white wall of chaos. When the door finally burst open again, Gabriel stumbled in, his eyebrows and beard encrusted with ice, clutching something wrapped in a heavy canvas tarp. He didn't head for the fire. Instead, he moved toward the back storeroom, his movements erratic and fueled by a sudden, desperate energy. Clara followed him, her lantern swinging and casting long, distorted shadows. He kicked aside a pile of old burlap, revealing a hidden corner of the room where a half-finished cradle sat, its wood gray with dust and neglect. He dropped the canvas, and Clara saw it was a bundle of seasoned cherry wood he had been seasoning for years, hidden away like a shameful secret. The sight of the cradle, intended for a child who had never drawn a breath, broke the final seal on Gabriel's silence. He stood over the unfinished piece, his broad shoulders shaking with a grief that had no voice, the ice melting from his hair and dripping onto the floor like tears. Clara didn't speak. She didn't offer the empty platitudes of a stranger. She simply went to her tool chest, retrieved her finest carving mallet and a curved gouge, and knelt beside the cradle. She began to scrape away the years of grime, the wood beneath appearing rich and warm in the lantern light. Gabriel watched her, his breath coming in ragged gasps, until slowly he sank to the floor beside her. He reached out a calloused hand, touching the grain of the wood she had revealed, and for the first time in 4 years, the frozen mask of his face began to crumble. The storm lasted 3 days, turning the world into a tomb of white. But inside the thorn house, a different kind of labor had begun. The kitchen table was moved to the center of the room, and for 72 hours, the only sound was the rhythmic shave of wood and the soft hiss of the fire. Gabriel and Clara worked in a synchronized trance, their hands moving over the cherry wood as they finished the cradle together. He did the heavy sanding, his powerful arms smoothing the rough edges of his own history, while Clara used her grandfather's tools to carve delicate vines of mountain ivy along the rockers. In the shared task, the barriers of status and gender evaporated, leaving only 2 artisans fighting to reclaim something beautiful from the wreckage of their lives. Gabriel began to speak, his voice rusty and hesitant at first, telling her of the wife who had loved the smell of the first rain and the daughter they had named in their hearts but never held. Clara, in turn, spoke of the fire in Philadelphia, the orange glow that had swallowed her world, and the guilt of being the only one to walk away. The confessions were not loud. They were whispered into the shavings of the wood, absorbed by the cherry grain until the cradle became a vessel for their combined sorrow. By the time the wind died down and the sun broke through the clouds, reflecting off the blinding snow, the cradle was finished. It shone with a deep inner light, polished with beeswax until it glowed. It was a memorial, but it was also a bridge. They sat together on the floor, exhausted and covered in sawdust, and Gabriel reached out to take Clara's hand. His grip was steady and warm, no longer the hand of a man who only knew how to destroy or endure, but the hand of a man who had remembered how to create. The loneliness of the Montana wilderness still waited outside the door, but the emptiness inside the house had been filled with something more resilient than grief. As the spring thaw began to send torrents of melted snow down the mountainsides, the thorn mill roared back to life with a new purpose. The local settlers, who had long avoided the widower's curse, began to see a different sight when they came for their lumber. They saw a woman with a stubborn chin and a sharp chisel working alongside the man they once feared. Clara no longer wore the thin, tattered coat of a fugitive. She wore a heavy wool shirt and a leather apron, her skin tanned by the high-altitude sun. The marriage of convenience that Gabriel had once hoped for had been replaced by a partnership of souls that neither had dared to imagine. They were married when the first glacier lilies poked through the receding snow, a quiet ceremony held on the porch of the house that was now a home. There was no finery, only the scent of fresh-cut pine and the steady gaze of 2 people who had looked into the abyss and chosen each other. They stood together on the bank of the rushing creek, watching the ice break and flow downstream, carrying away the remnants of a bitter season. Clara looked up at the mountains, no longer seeing them as walls, but as the boundaries of a sanctuary she had helped to build. Gabriel looked at his wife, and for the first time in nearly half a decade, a smile broke across his face, Not the fleeting grin of a younger man, but the deep, weathered expression of one who had earned his joy through the fire and the frost. They walked back toward the house together, their footsteps leaving a single path in the soft, awakening earth. They had asked for survival, and they had been given a life. They had sought wages and a roof, and they had found a devotion that was as old and as enduring as the mountains themselves. The road through the mountains is long, and the winters are unforgiving, but for those with the courage to stay, the rewards are written in the stars. You have been listening to the story of Gabriel and Clara on Dust and Devotion Tales. If this journey through the timber and the heart has touched you, please subscribe and share our stories with other weary travelers. Until the next tale unfolds, may your hearth stay warm and your spirit stay true.